Hey guys, welcome to Latitude. It's been a while since I've been here, but today we're going to talk about the civil rights movement and civil disobedience. But we can't talk about what is traditionally seen as the civil rights movement until we do some background. So, post-World War II, African Americans had a prominence in national affairs unseen since Reconstruction. The war inspired a new black militancy, think the Double V campaign, and rejection by white Americans of the Hitler-esque master race. States across the nation launched fair employment practices, and many cities fought segregation by passing laws against discrimination in access to jobs and public accommodations. A broad coalition involving labor unions, religious groups, and black organizations worked together to support these measures. So, the NAACP will launch a voter registration campaign in the South so that by 1952, 20% of black Southerners were registered to vote. Now, that doesn't sound like much, right? But this is a huge jump from the 3% that were registered in 1940. In fact, 1952 was a banner year. It was also the first year in 70 years of recording that there were no lynchings. Zero. None. Woohoo! Not hanging people. Also showing a shift in thinking, in 1947, the Brooklyn Dodgers challenged Major League Baseball standards by adding Jackie Robinson to their roster. And despite the onslaught of racist, verbal, and physical abuse that Robinson would have to endure, Robinson maintained a very quiet dignity. In fact, he promised the manager of the team that he would do that. And this, in turn, won over many Americans. So think like Booker T, where if you just keep going about your business, eventually you'll be accepted. And that actually does work. And his success in Major League Baseball will open the door for integration of baseball. And it will actually lead to the decimation of the Negro League and ultimately the integration of all sports. So Jackie Robinson and his fight for civil rights within sports and integration within sports will actually be seen as a major turning point within the civil rights movement. Now, also in the 40s, President Truman appointed a commission on civil rights who then released a viscerating indictment of racial inequality in America. In the context of a post-war Cold War era, President Truman noted that if the U.S. was to offer the world that ideal of freedom, we're all about freedom and democracy, then it must, quote unquote, correct the remaining imperfections in our practice of democracy. And he is basically talking about the fact that we still have segregation and we still have racism and we still have this divide between races. How do we match those two together? It's the same fight that we've had since the beginning. How do we talk in the Constitution about unalienable rights and founding principles, but at the same time have what's called the Three-Fifths Compromise, in which we don't even count African Americans or slaves as people. We count them as part of people for voting representation. So it's something that we've been fighting since the get-go. President Truman will actually go to Congress in the 40s, and he had a very tumultuous relationship with Congress, but he will go to them and he will propose to them and say, like a State of the Union address or something like that. He will say, Congress, we need to create some anti-lynching laws, we need to eliminate the poll tax, and we need to create equal access to jobs and education. Well, guess what? Congress said, no way, Truman, we're not doing it. So, just as a reminder, this progressive movement towards equality was met with massive white resistance, especially as the movement ramps up into the 50s and 60s, and most especially in the Jim Crow South. This conservative backlash led to a split in the Democratic Party and the rise of a third party, which I've talked about before. They called themselves the States' Rights Party, but they were more commonly known as the Dixiecrats. And their party platform called for the complete segregation of all races. Strom Thurmond, who was the party's presidential candidate, and guess what, a man who continued to be a U.S. Senator well into his 90s, which was just recently, claimed the basis of states' rights. Really? States' rights? States' rights to be racist, you mean? how well did that argument work out in the Civil War? Not too well, I'm assuming. So, despite major strides in the 1940s, by the 1950s, America had grown complacent, and they were consumed by that post-war economic boom, materialism, conformity, and most notably, suburbia. And the rise of suburban neighborhoods and the expansion of the highway system led to massive white flight from urban centers. And so this left these urban ghettos, these islands of poverty filled with predominantly minority communities. And as the decade wore on, this inequality became glaringly apparent. Racial exclusion is based on two things, right? Educational discrimination prevents educational opportunities at public and private universities, leaving minorities as unskilled laborers. And employment discrimination forces minorities into manual and unskilled jobs. So at no point are they allowed to advance beyond where they currently are. So the freedom movement begins. And let's review the foundations again, just to be very clear. 1, the destabilization of the racial hierarchy during and after World War II. The Great Migration, making African Americans this huge voting force or a voting bloc within the Democratic Party. The Cold War and the gap between American rhetoric of freedom and liberty and its racial reality. The segregated other half that did not enjoy the prosperity of the 50s. You know, everyone talks about the 50s being the greatest age, and they look back with nostalgia. Well, if you weren't white middle class, then guess what? Actually, if you weren't white middle class male, 50s were not so great for you. And then, of course, there's also Truman's Civil Rights Initiative was rejected by Congress, and then Eisenhower, who was the president after him, was really unwilling to get involved. So since the Congress and the president were reluctant to support the Civil Rights Movement, the issue fell to the courts. And court cases in the 1940s began pecking away at that Plessy v. Ferguson decision, you know, the separate but equal decision. They pecked away at Jim Crow, and they pecked away at segregation, and it was slow moving, but it was working. And it really starts in the Latino and the Mexican American communities, and they'll work to eliminate Hispanic segregation in California and Texas predominantly. So in California in 1946, LULAC will argue that Hispanics are the other white race in the Mendez v. Westminster case, and they will win. And this will crack open the door for other cases to come along. And in fact, it will be the basis or a precedent that the court case Delgado v. Bastrop ISD in Texas in 1948 will use. But they will also expand it, and they will use a more broad defense against segregation using the 14th Amendment. So not just that, hey, we're white people too, but hey, it doesn't matter if we're white, brown, yellow, red, green. Doesn't matter. We're American citizens, and by constitutional law, we have the basis for equal access to education and all that kind of stuff. So what's great about this is these Hispanic cases will then really make way for African Americans to step in and try and chip away at segregation. Because most laws, especially in the South, were regarding African Americans and not necessarily Mexican Americans. And so in 1950, 2 years later, a man named Heman Sweat is going to go to the University of Texas, and he's going to say, I want to apply for your law school. He is denied access to the UT Law School. And so he and the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall will go and basically sue them and say, so this is in the court case Heman v. Sweat, and this case is, they basically use the laws against them. All right, so what they're doing is they say, okay, well, according to the Texas Constitution, you have separate but equal. According to Plessy v. Ferguson, you have separate but equal. But guess what? You don't have a law school for African Americans at all. So not only do you not have anything equal, you don't have anything at all. And so this, again, will force Texas to scramble and create a law school so that Heman Sweat can go to it. But guess what? He ends up going to UT, and he doesn't graduate at the top of his class. He's not like an outstanding student, but he goes. All right? So this really is starting to pave the road and set the stage for our 1954 court case, Brown versus the Board of Education. And that's where we finally have the Supreme Court of the land, of the nation, is deciding on whether or not separate but equal is actually a thing. And they give, and it's one of my favorite lines, the opinion that the Chief Justice gives is that separate is inherently unequal. Hooah! Now it just came down to enforcing those verdicts, which, by the way, is easier said than done. Court cases can say a lot, but they can't do a lot. So from there, white resistance will become more fervent within southern states, and they refuse to enforce those Supreme Court decisions and desegregate schools, and all but 3 southern congressmen will sign what is now known as the Southern Manifesto. So this, combined with an apathetic executive branch, would slow integration to an almost standstill through the rest of the 50s. And in 1959, in Little Rock, Arkansas, Governor Orville Faubus, not a nice guy, by the way, will use the National Guard to prevent the court-ordered integration of Central High School in Little Rock. And this flagrant violation of court order forces Eisenhower to act. Because it's one thing to just kind of turn a blind eye, but when you put it out there and you use like actual forces, federal forces, to prevent a court-ordered integration, Eisenhower's like, look, my job is to enforce the Constitution, and you are clearly violating it. So I'm going to go ahead and send federal forces. And he sends out the 101st Airborne, which, guess what, trumps National Guard. So National Guard, by pecking order of the military, has to get out of the way. And they escort these kids every day for that year. But guess what? Those guys can't be with them every day. All right? All 9 of these kids, they'll be famously called the Little Rock 9. All 9 of them will survive that year, but only 3 of them will actually graduate from Central High. The rest will either move away, drop out, or get expelled. And all of them will deal with violent verbal and physical abuse from the white students and the teachers. So it was not a good year. But, all of them, still go and they talk about it. And their experience there. See, because the biggest problem is, as great as the Brown v. Board verdict was, it was a limited document. It did not address segregation in anything but public schools, nor did it ban racial classifications and laws. So, thankfully, mass civil disobedience will spark again when Rosa Parks refuses to surrender her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. Just to be clear, though, she was not, the tired old seamstress that had just had a hard day and didn't want to get up. That's not the whole story. She was a secretary for the NAACP. And this was a planned event in that this scenario was planned on how it would go, just not when. And she was not even the first person to do this. A girl named Claudette Colvin had already done this a few times to try and upset the system, but unfortunately, she doesn't receive credit because, well, and this is a lesson in PR and marketing, but she was 15 years old, unwed, and pregnant. And so the NAACP didn't really want that as the face of their movement. So when Rosa Parks did it, they really got behind her. But it doesn't really matter how it happened, because it happened, and this action will spark a 381-day Montgomery bus boycott and will launch the nonviolence crusade based in black churches into national prominence. Guess who else it boosts to national prominence? Martin Luther King, as you've been reading in your books. So Martin Luther King, who was a preacher, he's actually going to use that black church base to organize and create a group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, and combine those people with the African American college students who organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which is more commonly referred to as SNCC. These 2 groups will begin mobilizing a nonviolent campaign against all public segregation, most notably in 1960 when 4 students sit down at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now, these lunch counters were reserved for white customers only. And they just sit there, and they sit there all day. They're told they won't get served. They don't care. They just sit there. And it basically starts this snowball effect, and these sit-ins start occurring all over the South. And they have to withstand people, because at first people are just kind of shocked that they have the audacity to try and sit down, and they don't do anything. They just stare at them weirdly. But eventually, when it keeps happening, it's not. It's a little bit more than that. The white reaction to this is violence, and people throw food at them and call them horrible names. And the people sitting at these lunch counters just have to sit there, and they just have to take it. And this kind of reaction to such violence will actually inspire more things to continue to occur. So these sit-ins will happen all over the South. But other forms of direct action will follow the sit-ins. African Americans in Mississippi will engage in what are called wade-ins for access to segregated beaches. So like all of these people would walk into the waters or walk onto the beaches and just sit there and take abuse. There were peaceful marches across towns throughout the Deep South, with the most famous one, especially recently, with the Selma to Montgomery marches held during Freedom Summer in 1964. So, as this story goes on, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, will organize and launch freedom rides to test the idea of desegregating the busing systems. And integrated groups will travel by bus into the Deep South, and they were not met nicely. In fact, they were met by violent mobs. In Alabama, a bus was firebombed, and riders were held inside until the last possible moment. And when they were escaping, when they were finally let out, they pulled them and started beating them within an inch of their life as they escaped. So it's either get a beating or die by fire. In Birmingham, buses were stopped, riders were pulled off and beaten by the KKK with bats and chains. All the while, police are refusing to intervene on the riders' behalf. In fact, oftentimes when the assault was done, the riders were arrested and put in jail. It's not a pretty picture. But probably the most tumultuous and violent town in the South is going to be Birmingham. Birmingham became an epicenter of civil rights fervor. Birmingham, Alabama was a traditionally segregated town. There had been over 50 bombings of black homes and institutions since World War II. So the African Americans in the town invited Martin Luther King to come help and revive their flagging movement. Because when you're dealing with that kind of violence, guess what? You don't really want to get involved anymore. You want to protect your family. You want to protect your home. So, but Martin Luther King, he sees this, and he immediately goes down to Birmingham, and he is almost immediately arrested. And he will sit for 9 days in a Birmingham jail, and that's where he will write his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. And it's written in response to the white clergymen who were telling Martin Luther King and his followers, you know what, chill out, be patient, follow God's plan. But Martin Luther King responds with this idea of, here's everything that's happening to us. How is this God's plan? This is not God's plan. I am following God's plan. And it's a really powerful letter, and I recommend you reading it. King and other activists will decide to send black school children to march in the streets in Birmingham. Now that's huge, to send children out. I mean, and they had children from like 5th grade to high school walking the streets in protest, silently for the most part, but in protest of segregation. And the sheriff of Birmingham, his name is Bull Connor. Bull is a nickname. I don't know if I'd ever want that nickname, but Bull Connor will see all this happening, and so instead of going, oh crap, these are kids, what are we going to do? He's like, nah, I'm going to teach them a lesson. And so he unleashes his police forces on these kids, and the nation, because everything's televised now, the nation will watch on TV while young children are being beaten with nightsticks, they're being sprayed with fire hoses, and they're being bitten by police attack dogs. So how do you think, you're sitting in Chicago or New York City, and you see what's happening in Birmingham, Alabama. You're sitting in the White House in D.C., and you're watching this happen on TV. What do you think people are thinking? So white Americans were really forced to start questioning their loyalties, to really start questioning whether or not they wanted to be seen aligning with a group that did this horrible thing to these children, being aligned with a group of people that engaged in a horrific murder of an NAACP activist, Medgar Evans, that participated in church bombings. The Birmingham Baptist church bombing is a pivotal moment because 4 girls will be killed in that bombing. And so white Americans are like, oh, I don't know if this is really what I believe in. So ideology is starting to shift elsewhere. And on August 28th in 1963, 250,000 black and white Americans will converge on Washington, D.C. And this march is organized by a man, by more than just him, but he was the brains behind it. His name was A. Philip Randolph, and he will organize what will later be called as the Million Man March. And this is going to be the largest public demonstration in the nation's history to that time. A pending civil rights bill was, taking center stage because it was going on in Congress. It was going onto the floor in Congress. But really, the whole purpose of that march was this idea of jobs and freedom, end segregation, give us unlimited access, or give us, as much access as everyone else has to all jobs. And this campaign is really going to get a lot of people motivated. It's at this march that Martin Luther King will deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. But it's also here that John Lewis's rhetoric begins to change. John Lewis is the guy who helped put SNCC together, and you've been reading about him. But his rhetoric begins to change from that peaceful, nonviolent message to one of frustration and anger, to one where it's like, it's too little too late. This civil rights bill, we've been dying on the streets and you guys have been doing nothing. And unfortunately, this frustration, not necessarily for John Lewis, but for huge groups within the African American community, it will grow throughout the 1960s as eventually the African American civil rights movement will turn darker and more violent because of the very slow-moving process of the civil disobedience route. And people wanted freedom now. And they were listening to the rhetoric of Malcolm X. And then the Black Panthers were formed, who were a much more militant group. And so things began to change. Catch me next time to see the rest of it.